Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme today, President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff leaves Moscow empty-handed after talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. We ask, what happens now? Plus, as tensions escalate over potential military action by the United States in Venezuela, we examine the most likely scenarios. And we ask what President Trump might have in mind. Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, efforts to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine continue. Yesterday, President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, together with the president's son-in-law Jared Kushner, travelled to Moscow for talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, despite this flurry of diplomacy, the path to a deal remains unclear. Russia is accused of rejecting the US peace proposal. That's something the Kremlin denies. Well, the issue of territory remains a core sticking point. And this has left the United States trying to work out what Ukraine and Russia will ultimately agree on. Well, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed this in an interview with Fox News.
What they're literally fighting over now is about 30 to 50 kilometer space in the 20% of the Donetsk region that remains. And so what we have tried to do, and I think have made some progress, is figure out what can the Ukrainians live with that gives them security guarantees for the future. They're never going to be invaded again, allows them not just to rebuild their economy, but to prosper as a country, be a country that has an economy that grows, theoretically, doing the right things. In 10 years, Ukraine's GDP could be larger than Russia's. That's what we're trying to achieve here. So what can Ukraine agree to, given all the dynamics that I've just described, and what will Russia agree to?
Well, I'm pleased to say we're joined now by John Bolton, who is the former US National Security Advisor and former US Ambassador to the United Nations. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Bolton. Always a pleasure having you on the programme. Now, on Monday, President Trump held talks with his top advisors to discuss the pressure campaign on Venezuela. I'd like to start by asking you, what do you think is President Trump's intended outcome with regards to Venezuela?
Well, that's obviously the critical question, and I have to say I can't give you a good answer. I don't know what his desired outcome is. He has said it's not regime change, but on the other hand, he's apparently threatened Maduro with severe consequences if he doesn't leave the country. He's had the U.S. military attacking drug boats. So is it something to do with illegal narcotics trafficking, terrorism? I think the problem is in Trump's mind, it's all muddled together. And he really has not made a final decision. I think he's gotten himself into a potentially difficult position on a number of fronts because, as is unfortunately so often the case, he hasn't thought through in a systematic way what he's trying to accomplish and what he needs to do to get there. So it would be embarrassing in some circumstances not to be able to give you a direct answer, but I don't think Trump himself knows.
He has deployed the world's largest aircraft carrier and several other military assets to the Caribbean. Do you think we're looking at a situation in which US military intervention in Venezuela looks increasingly likely?
You know, I'd have to say from all the steps that have been taken that the answer to that question is yes. I think Trump would look incredibly foolish and really harm his own personal image, not to mention the United States, if he's brought the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group all the way from Europe to the Caribbean and then sends them back effectively without using them. But this is an example of the confusion in Trump's thinking. It's the cart before the horse. He brings in this incredible military capability without deciding what he's going to do with it or what he hopes to achieve. And now he's got a problem that if he doesn't use it, he looks even more erratic than in fact he is.
Now, we've agreed that we're not sure whether regime change and overthrowing President Maduro is indeed President Trump's desired outcome here. But in your opinion, is that the right outcome? Would President Trump be right to want Nicolas Maduro to be overthrown?
Yes, I support overthrowing the Maduro regime. We supported that objective in the first Trump term. We used essentially economic pressure, but unfortunately not nearly enough to accomplish that objective. I think the U.S. has a significant national security interest at stake in Venezuela, the presence of a major Russian contingent, their surrogates, the Cubans, the Chinese, the Iranians, using Caracas as a base for financial activity and support for Hezbollah. All of these are threats to U.S. national security and to our colleagues in the rest of the Western Hemisphere, not to mention the people of Venezuela that have suffered under the Chavez-Maduro regime for 25 years now. So I think we've got good reasons to want to seek a regime change. I think we would be justified in using military force. But given that we tried to work with the Venezuelan opposition in 2018 and 19 to oust Maduro and failed, I think it's incumbent on the administration to get it right this time. And that's what I'm worried they don't have.
So what's your sort of forecast with regards to what happens next? Do you envisage a negotiated exit for Maduro? And we have had some insights into that following on from the telephone conversation between President Trump and Nicolas Maduro. Or do you think military intervention is the more likely route? What would be your prediction?
Well, I'd be surprised at this point if there's not some military activity, but whether that's enough to convince Maduro to go, whether it splits the top ranks of the Venezuelan military, I have to say I'm skeptical. Back in 2019, when the opposition launched what it hoped and believed could well be a successful regime change effort, they found that the Russians and the Cubans had basically said to Maduro, "You're not leaving." And I think given the stakes that those two countries, not to mention China and Iran, have in keeping that regime in place, they may not respond overtly to the use of military force by Washington, but I think they'll try and have Maduro's back and convince him not to leave.
Let's start talking now about the situation with regards to efforts to broker an end to the war in Ukraine. I'd like to start this chapter by asking you why you think Steve Witkoff is leaving Moscow, by all accounts, empty-handed.
Well, I don't think it's surprising he's leaving empty-handed. His initial plan, at least according to press reports a few weeks ago, was essentially a perfect from Russia's point of view. And indeed, many people thought Russia had given him the plan and he had taken it as his. It's been scrubbed by Ukrainians and European friends of Ukraine in Geneva. A week or so ago, it was discussed again with the Ukrainians by Secretary Rubio, and many changes were made. Now, if what we're entering into now is a period of negotiation, this all plays to Russia's advantage, because I think Putin and the Kremlin believe that they can persuade Trump that they're making the better case. But as of now, I don't see any progress. My prediction for the rest of the year, let's put it that way, would be simply that the fighting continues. There may be additional discussions on a potential deal, but I think for now it appears stalled.
In an article in the British newspaper The Telegraph, you described Steve Witkoff's brokering as being, quote, simply pro-Russian. And I'd like to ask you what you believe his motivations are. Why would he be pro-Russian?
I don't think he has the slightest understanding of 35 plus years of tension between an independent Ukraine and Russia. I think his knowledge of history and the region is minimal. I think he acts like a real estate dealer, and there's nothing wrong with being a real estate dealer, but the Ukrainians are fighting not for a specific piece of territory that can be divided up. They're fighting for their freedom and independence. It's existential for them. And the Russians, although I don't agree with the Kremlin's position, under Vladimir Putin, they're fighting to recreate the Russian Empire. That's pretty important for them. And the idea that some utterly inexperienced, uninformed negotiator, simply because he's loyal to Donald Trump, is going to find an answer here, I think is naive and potentially dangerous. It's certainly dangerous for Ukraine, which has faced now nearly 4 years of unprovoked aggression from Moscow.
We've heard from the Russians yesterday. In fact, President Putin said the Europeans aren't serious about peace and that Russia is ready for war. What do you make of that?
Well, I think this is obviously part of the Russian propaganda effort to show their resolve has not weakened at all, that they still believe victory will be theirs. And indeed, there are plenty of indications that the Russians think that after almost 4 years, this war of attrition against Ukraine may be close, perhaps in the spring, perhaps by the summer of next year, that Ukraine's military will simply crack. I don't think that's right, but they may be gambling if they can simply keep this going for another 8 or 9 months. They may get not only the territory they've been asking for, they could get much more as well.
There are quite a lot of analysts who are suggesting there are some splits in the ranks of the Trump administration when it comes to foreign policy, particularly this issue. Are you detecting that? Some are talking about strong differences of opinion, differences of approach between, for example, Vance and Rubio. What are you detecting?
Well, I think there are splits. I think they are beginning to emerge on Ukraine, but perhaps on Venezuela as well. A big part of Trump's base is really fundamentally isolationist, and they don't see why protecting Ukraine is in America's national interest, although I believe very strongly that it is. And they certainly, this MAGA base, do not want to see Trump start a new war in Venezuela. They thought that he was going to end endless wars, not begin new ones. I think Vance really reflects that MAGA base, and I think he is in conflict with Rubio. They've done an excellent job of avoiding leaks from the administration in the second term, I have to say. But it also mirrors splits within the Republican Party. I think Republican support for Ukraine in Congress is really very strong, Trump notwithstanding. And I think support is strong in Congress among Republicans for overthrowing Maduro as well. I think they can see the incompetence in the administration, and that's what really worries them. But this is also part of a broader trend that's happening in Washington over the past 30 days. I think people now see, because of the election results last month and a special election yesterday in Tennessee, that Trump's popularity is declining and his base is beginning to fragment. So I think he's past the point of being a new president and has begun the slide into being a lame duck president.
Right, and I'm assuming that's what you meant in your Economist piece where you described America as being past peak Trump. Just to wrap up, Ambassador Bolton, on the subject of foreign policy, who do you think President Trump trusts the most when it comes to foreign policy?
I think he trusts his own instincts. I think he listens to people basically to find somebody who agrees with the direction he's already going in. That doesn't mean he always follows his own impulses, but he thinks he knows this game pretty well. I think that's largely incorrect, but he never has lacked for self-confidence. Nobody would ever say that.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. John Bolton, former U.S. National Security Advisor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring into the conversation Mick Mulvaney, the former Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump. Mick, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure having you on Arabiya English. I'd like to start by asking you, are you surprised that Steve Witkoff and the rest of the delegation is essentially returning to Washington empty-handed?
Not really. I mean, the pattern has sort of been to return with something, that have that something turn out to nothing. So I guess returning empty-handed, if you want to use that term, really isn't that big of a surprise. They need to change the dynamic. They really do. They need to change sort of the status quo right now. I think what the American team is realizing that the Russians are not interested in ending the war anytime soon, and they still think they're going to get a better deal on the battlefield than they are at the table. And until that calculation changes, I don't see much possibility for success. Clearly, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to cut a deal with somebody when they don't want to cut a deal.
I mean, what you're saying sounds very much like what a lot of European heads of state and leaders are saying. And they've been sort of shut out of the conversation. Well, at least they say they feel blindsided and somewhat excluded. I mean, why doesn't President Trump want to hear that line of argument?
Oh, I think it's okay to hear the line of argument. The question is, if you want to have Europe sit at the table with you and have a conversation, who is that? I mean, which of the 27 people speak for Europe? I mean, if it's Ursula, then that's fine, I guess, but I get the impression that it's not. And then within the 27, you've got, the UK who have done a great deal of work, the Germans who have started to sort of kick in, the French who have been sort of late to the game in terms of actually providing support, and then the Spanish and the Italians who've done nothing. So does somebody who doesn't participate in the fighting of the war get to contribute to the discussions about ending the war? I think that's a fair conversation to have. What you're seeing here, though, Tom, is the general sort of antipathy that Trump and his administration have to dealing with multilateral organizations. They don't like them. They don't trust them. They don't really they can't get their heads around them, and they'd much rather deal bilaterally with people.
The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is a notable absentee at the gathering of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels today. What do you read into that?
I wouldn't read too much into it. I know it's going to get a lot of attention because I know that's how people sort of look at the world, but Marco would be in regular communication with those folks anyway. Today is not a really good day for him to be away from the office. If you, judging by the cabinet meeting, the 2.5-hour cabinet meeting that Trump had yesterday, which was televised to just about everywhere, that something in Venezuela could be imminent. And it's probably more important for the Secretary of State, who's also doing double duty as the National Security Advisor, to sort of stick close to home when times are tense like that.
Mick, I'm going to be asking you a bit about Venezuela, if you don't mind, in a couple of minutes. So we'll come back to that. But just staying with these efforts to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine, something that Marco Rubio said, the US Secretary of State said, he said it would be irrational not to be engaging with Moscow. Do you think the Americans should be talking to the Russians at this stage? Or perhaps do you think it's premature in the absence of any indication from the Russians that they actually want peace?
I know there's several schools of thought on this. I've always been in the same camp as Marco. Of course, Marco was in the Senate when I was in the House. I've known him now for about 15 years, which is nothing usually bad comes from talking to people. I remember going back to the debates between Barack Obama and John McCain about who would talk to who. And it seems like everybody at some point or the other wants to talk to somebody else unless your political opponent is talking to them, in which case you criticize them for talking to them. So, look, I think that's been overly politicized. I see no harm in having the lines of communication open. Whether or not those lines of communication are back channels at mid-levels or at the very highest levels, I don't think really makes a difference. It doesn't change, though, Tom, what we talked about at the outset, which is talk all you want, but until you convince the Russians that they want a deal, you're not going to get one. So I'm not sure how much talking changes that, unless there's subject matters in those discussions that I'm not fully aware of.
Steve Witkoff's been to Moscow 7 times now, by my count. Maybe maybe you have another number for me. But do you get the impression he's the right person to be negotiating in this way on this sort of issue with the Russians? He hasn't delivered results. Do you think President Trump might have a change of heart with regard to his
I suppose it's possible. We hear the rumor that Jared Kushner may get involved. I think Steve has done a pretty good job in other parts of the world. And importantly, and I can't stress this enough, Tom, when it comes to the operation of the White House. I don't know much about international geopolitics. I know a little bit about running the White House. And having somebody who is involved in those negotiations, who has the full trust of the President of the United States, a full line of communication with the President of the United States, and a read on the President's state of mind, that's probably some of the more important things you can have in a negotiator. I used to tell people when I was a special envoy to Northern Ireland, look, I might not know that much about Northern Ireland. I know a little bit about it, but I do know if I pick up the phone and make a call, the President's going to take it. And that's probably the most important sort of thing that someone can bring to the negotiations, especially when so many decisions, as with the Trump administration, get made at the very top ultimately.
Right, but there are a lot of people on this particular dossier in the Trump administration. We've talked about Marco Rubio, we've talked about Steve Witkoff, there's Jared Kushner, there's different schools of thought perhaps from Vice President J.D. Vance. There are rumors of differences of opinion on what the right approach is. Do you buy into that? Do you think there are perhaps some splits in the inner circle of President Trump?
Not only do I believe it, I would fully expect it. What you've just described is how Donald Trump operates. What you've just said could apply to his negotiations on tax policy domestically. They can apply to trade policy overseas. Trump likes to have more than one senior advisor, more than one senior person involved in negotiations at this level. So that doesn't surprise me. And he's always encouraged sort of debate within his team. He likes people to disagree. Oftentimes, Tom will see himself as sort of a moderator, a mediator, a judge, so that it's okay and, in fact, encouraged to have people who might have differing opinions on how to handle Ukraine, how to handle trade, et cetera. So, no, that doesn't surprise me. In fact, what would surprise me if it was simply one person speaking with one voice for the President of the United States, because that's not how the president works. The only one person that really speaks for Donald Trump is Donald Trump.
So you don't think there's one person who stands out amongst all of these different people as being the person that perhaps President Trump trusts the most when it comes to foreign policy issues?
No, I think it could change day to day. I think it could change topic to topic. For example, I think Marco Rubio is probably the leading voice when it comes to Venezuela right now, but I'd be surprised, I'd be stunned if he was the only voice. Same would be the case with Witkoff overseas, probably the leading voice, but Trump is going to listen to a bunch of different people. I don't necessarily see that as a weakness. In fact, there'd be several folks, I think, who could make the case it's a strength. So no, it doesn't surprise me that it's running like this. If you want to be critical of it, be critical of the results, not the process. Be critical of the fact that Trump thought he's had a deal now 4 or 5 different times. The meeting in Alaska directly with Putin comes to mind, and that's not happened. And that sooner or later, someone's going to have to realize that maybe the Russians aren't that interested in ending this war. And until you change that calculation, the war is not going to end.
Okay, so if that calculation changes, do you see President Trump saying, right, okay, the negotiating table doesn't work, back to the battlefield, let's give Ukraine better weaponry, more weaponry, and give them a better chance of winning this war?
It's certainly one of the options that are available. There's no question. If you ask Trump, he would never take that option off of the table. If he did, it would completely hamstring him in the negotiations. So that has to be on the table. All of the options have to be on the table, up to including completely walking away. That's what you say if you need to try to motivate the Ukrainians to move towards a deal, or escalating the conflict, which is what you might say to negotiate, to encourage the Russians. On that spectrum of possibilities, there's probably limitless options. And Trump is not known for taking them off the table, and I don't expect him to take any options off the table here.
Let's talk about Venezuela. It's already come up in conversation a couple of times, and I did say we'd get around to it. I mean, looking at all the facts before us, looks like there's something of an escalation happening in the Caribbean. What do you think is President Trump's desired outcome with regards to Venezuela?
Yeah, I don't know. This one confuses me a little bit more than Ukraine. I think I understand Ukraine. Again, it doesn't mean that I know how to fix it, but I think I understand the lay of the land and why we're doing what we're doing. Venezuela's a little bit more confusing to me. We had these exact discussion, Tom, in the first Trump administration about what we were going to do, if anything, about Maduro and so forth. And Trump regularly pushed back against any sort of suggestion of military action in the region. Clearly, that has changed, or at least is apparently changed. As one naval expert put it to me the other day, you don't move the George Bush aircraft carrier into a region and not use it. So I think many of us here expect some type of kinetic action in the near future, which is really surprising to me. I still don't foresee a circumstance where Donald Trump would commit land troops, American soldiers on the ground in Venezuela. But it's looking more and more like he is willing to do, some what we call tomahawk diplomacy, sort of a standoff attack from a distance and so forth. That is surprising to me because it is a sea change from where we were in the first term. My guess is it's the influence of Marco Rubio, influence of some of the other Latin nations, and the reinvigoration of the Monroe Doctrine that we are going to pay much closer attention to everything in the Western Hemisphere.
And how's this going to go down with President Trump's support base? Because President Trump came to power very much on a ticket that he wasn't going to be starting more wars. He was going to be ending wars. I mean, there's already some disquiet about certain foreign policy issues in the ranks of Team MAGA. I mean, doesn't this go against what he campaigned for?
It depends. Keep in mind, let's draw some parallels. They're not perfect parallels and analogies, and I get that, but there are some between the action against Iran. It was a one-off. It was a massive blow with tremendous apparent results, okay? And that helped Trump politically. That was well received politically. I think if there's some sort of similar action in Venezuela that is very, very limited, especially in duration, it won't hurt President Trump Hardly at all. In fact, I can make the argument if it goes well, it could help him politically. Americans don't care that much about foreign policy, but when we like it when we have successes overseas. The other end of the spectrum there is, though, if for whatever reason we end up getting bogged down in some type of military action in Venezuela, that would be received extraordinarily poorly. It's hard to exaggerate how poorly that would be received. I think right now the polling data would suggest that only like 20% of Americans would actually support a sustained military action in Venezuela, if that high. Donald Trump is not usually on the wrong side of 80-20 political issues. So I don't see him getting involved in something long-term. But if that is what happens, that will reflect very badly upon him personally, and also weigh many of the Republicans down as they go into the midterm elections later in 2026, because they either have to choose to be going with a very unpopular president on that issue or against a very popular president on other issues. And that's not a fun place to be when you're running for re-election.
So your prediction would be, you don't think he's going to go for a sustained military campaign in Venezuela. Do you think a surgical, quick, clean strike would be a more likely line of action?
Much more likely. I think the chances of doing nothing are probably about 10%. I think the chances of doing something long-term with soldiers engaged on the ground is probably less than 5%, and the other 85% then would be a limited sort of surgical type of effort.
Okay, and I mean, what is it that President Trump is so upset about with regards to Venezuela? Is it the narcotics, or is it the immigration dimension? What do you think it is that's really made President Trump so incandescent with regards to President Maduro?
It's probably a little bit of both. The drugs is serious. It is. I mean, they inflate the numbers, of course, in terms of the number of deaths that they've prevented with their military action up to now. They try to claim that, they've killed enough drug runners to save X number of American lives, but not nearly that many people died from fentanyl drugs overdoses in the United States in the last couple of years. So there's a little bit of hyperbole in there, but don't let that distract you from the fact that Trump really does care about the drug flow and really does care about immigration. I don't think that's the only difference, though, here, Tom, because that existed in 2019 when I was the chief of staff. Both of those conditions did. The Venezuelans were running drugs, and they were encouraging the illegal immigration on our southern border. That hasn't changed. What's changed is Marco Rubio, an aggressive anti-communist, as you would expect a Cuban American to be, taking the role of the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. Again, I'll come back to the same thing we started off with, which is what surprises me is that John Bolton was just as eager to do something kinetic in Venezuela as it appears that Marco Rubio is. So I'm not sure what's changed, but clearly we're looking at a possibly different course of action than we took 5 years ago.
I mean, if you asked Nicolas Maduro what the main interest was that President Trump had in his country, he would probably point to the estimated 300 billion barrels of oil that Venezuela sits on, a fifth of the world's oil reserves. I mean, is oil a factor here?
I would think so. I mean, Trump has several times, suggested that foreign policy under the Obama administration should have focused on, taking more oil out of the Middle East. So is that maybe floating through Trump's head? Probably. Now, I don't know what form that would take. Again, I can't imagine it would be an invasion with an American takeover of the oil fields. But there may be some calculation here that the dealing with the next Venezuelan government might be more beneficial to America when it comes to getting Venezuelan oil. Certainly, that would be part of the calculation. But I don't see it as sort of a precursor towards an invasion.
Just lastly, I want to circle back to Ukraine very briefly, because we've got a bit more information than we did at the start of the conversation about what's being discussed in Brussels at that NATO gathering. We've heard Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, saying in the last hour or so, NATO is a defensive alliance. We will remain a defensive alliance, but make no mistake, we're ready and willing to do what it takes to protect our 1 billion people and secure our territory. I mean, this comes the day after President Putin said the Europeans wanted war and that Russia was ready for war. I mean, what do you make of this? Are we looking at a serious escalation here?
I don't know if you're looking at a serious escalation, but certainly the rhetoric is a lot hotter than it has been recently. I think and I have this conversation with a lot of my American friends, it is important to note that Ukraine is not a NATO country. I get it's important. I'm not trying to diminish that. And the domino theories, I get all of that. I'm aware. I'm as aware of that as everybody else is. But Ukraine is not a NATO country, and we should not treat it the same as we would a signatory to the treaty. But yeah, to your point, that is a much higher level of rhetoric. If anything, I'm glad to see that the European nations took Donald Trump's chastisement to heart several years ago when he encouraged them to increase their defense spending, because this seemed to be the way the world was going with a Putin-led Russia anyway. So look, I'm not too worried about a dramatic military escalation yet. But certainly, increases of inflammatory rhetoric often do presage such developments.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to William Alberg, who is the former director of NATO's Arms Controls, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Center. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. As we speak, NATO foreign ministers have been gathering in Brussels. They're holding talks there the day after that famous set of talks in Moscow that doesn't seem to have yielded a result. Interestingly, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio isn't there in Brussels. Is that significant?
It's at least unusual. The NATO is famous for actually moving the dates of foreign and defense ministerials in order to accommodate any potential U.S. absence, the U.S. being such an important member of the alliance. The last time I could find that this happened was back in 2003. I think it was in June 10 to 12 when Secretary Powell could not make it because of the Gulf War. And even in 2017, under Rex Tillerson, he had indicated he wasn't going to make it to an April 2017 meeting. And so they moved it to March just to accommodate him. So it's unusual. I don't think it's necessarily a signal. I think based on everything else that's happening today, it makes a little bit of sense for Rubio to want to be flexible. But still, it's not something that happens very frequently at all.
Knowing NATO as you do, and knowing what's been happening in the last few days, what do you suppose the mood is like in that room in Brussels?
I suppose the mood is very dark. I think they're really watching very closely as the U.S. negotiates with Russia in Moscow. It's a little bit disheartening because the European position, which was in solidarity with the United States, was nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine in the room. So to see Jared Kushner and Witkoff in a room with Vladimir Putin without Ukraine at the table is disappointing. I would also say there's a little tinge of optimism because they have managed, I think, to reshape the initial draft that we saw of the Russian proposal into something a little bit more acceptable. And I think the lack of a big signature, meeting at the end of it, the announcement of some big breakthrough, leaves everyone a little bit cautiously optimistic that perhaps Putin is up to his old tricks.
Right. I mean, President Putin said that document in its current form, this fine-tuned, as President Trump put it, a version of that original 28-point plan, President Putin said it could be the basis for future agreements. I mean, as you say, there is some cause for some optimism. He hasn't written it off outright. But you could also argue that he's playing for time here, isn't he?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, why did this proposal emerge right now? Clearly, Russia wanted to leak the proposal in its maximalist form to put Ukraine under pressure, but also, I think, to distract from a U.S. Senate effort to impose even stricter sanctions on Russia. You'll recall the last time we really saw a push for peace was when Trump threatened secondary sanctions on Russia's trading partners. So I think that plus the EU, the European Union's effort to confiscate Russian seized funds also gave Russia an impetus to do this, to kick these two proposals into the long grass and to, advance on the battlefield with no real intention of accepting anything other than an absolute maximalist position that I think Putin knew Ukraine would never accept. But maybe he hoped that the United States would be willing to put Zelensky under enough pressure to accept it. In this regard, I think the European pushback on this has been very well designed and timed, and I think we're back sort of like to square one at this point. But again, we'll see. More could come out over the next day or so about what the meeting is and what the next steps are.
Yeah, I mean, a number of European countries have expressed some disquiet about the fact that they believe they have been sidelined by President Trump's efforts. And I just want to ask you why you think President Trump would want to sideline the Europeans.
I mean, let me give the most generous interpretation that he really does believe that he can make a breakthrough here, that he really can, if he just puts things in the right way, find a path towards peace. And so I think in that regard, having many, many voices at the table is not the most efficient negotiating mechanism. So I can understand, given, again, the most generous interpretation, why he would do that. And the most cynical interpretation, obviously, he wants to keep them out because ultimately Ukraine, no matter what happens next, is a European issue with global consequences, of course, but it's in their neighborhood. So they're going to want a better deal than I think the United States would be willing to fight for. And ultimately, any peacekeeping force is going to have to come from Europe. So, he wants to keep complicating factors out of the room, basically in order to have carte blanche to come to an agreement as he sees fit. But again, I think every time he's done this with Putin, he's run into that brick wall of Putin not wanting to stop at all and doing this more for cynical reasons rather than actual genuine moves for peace. So on the one hand, I understand why you would want Europe out of the room for efficiency's sake, but ultimately Europe is going to have to be heard. And I think they've been very effective behind the scenes at working with Trump and his team to try to push back a little bit. And again, maybe that's why Rubio is closer to the president right now rather than in Moscow or in Brussels.
Do you think there are divisions in President Trump's inner sanctum on what the right way to proceed is on this particular issue?
Oh, I think it's absolutely true. I think the J.D. Vance and Hegseth part of the cabinet very much, and Tulsi Gabbard and all those folks, want to wash their hands of this particular conflict. I presume they're very excited about going to war with Venezuela now, I guess. I suppose that's what's happening. And so the appetite for Europe and for Ukraine is very, very low. And I think Rubio has been playing a much smarter game, trying to make sure that if the president engages, he does listen to other people. He listens to Zelensky and he listens to the Europeans. So I think Rubio, has a longer-term view of European allies and U.S. interests in Ukraine and some suspicion of Russia. And again, Hegseth and Vance are just willing to throw European and Ukrainian interest under the bus for the sake of what they perceive as the base's desire to disentangle.
Do you think there are some allies of the United States that are trying to persuade the United States, persuade President Trump of a new approach, perhaps? I mean, looking at the situation on the battlefield right now, Russia has the upper hand, and I think everyone agrees that, they're not making lightning speed advances, but they are making advances. And I'm wondering whether perhaps that is affecting the dynamic of the negotiations. But were that to change, and were Ukraine to be given more equipment, more material to be able to somehow reverse those gains and reverse the fortunes on the battlefield, whether perhaps that would change the nature and the mood of the next set of negotiations, which perhaps won't be for a little while?
Look, if this negotiation really comes to nothing, I think the Europeans will have a clear path to convince Trump, as you said, to change his approach. Because, as I mentioned before, the United States has been most effective in terms of bringing Russia to the table when it threatens something that Russia really cares about, for instance, its access to trading partners. So I think it should be pretty easy to convince Trump that a maximum pressure approach is wise. It's a phrase he's used before. It's something that he's taken credit for before. And you've seen in other negotiations, very difficult ones that he's been involved in, he's been willing to turn on the party that you most thought that he would be backing in order to get to an agreement towards peace. So I do think it is possible, and it should be possible, for the Europeans to convince Trump to put maximum pressure on Russia, not just to threaten it, but to do it, to actually start sanctioning secondary trading partners like India for taking Russian oil. And I think if that really happens, and if he helps the EU confiscate Russian assets and makes new moves from the United States point of view to put Russia under pressure and to, as you said, supply Ukraine with more equipment, then I think you could see Putin's point of view change very, very rapidly, and him be willing to accept a much more a peace that's much more stable and much more in the interests of long-term stability and the Europeans.
Right, and we don't know how many people have died in this war, but the US estimates are that 1.2 million men have either been killed or injured in this war. We can assume that a large number of those are Russian.
Right.
But I mean, can President Putin really keep this war going with losses like that, with round after round of sanctions? I mean, isn't he feeling that perhaps the time is coming, we're getting to a stage where this war does have to come to a conclusion?
I wish I could say yes. I don't think so. I think his appetite for losses, his willingness to accept casualties is truly astonishing. And I mean, no one could have predicted this. In Afghanistan, the Soviets lost a fraction of the number of soldiers that they've lost in this conflict. And it created a widespread movement against the government. The mothers and wives of the Afghan veterans was a huge force in bringing about change in Moscow. So the fact that they've lost, an order of magnitude more soldiers, and yet they still are hitting their conscription targets. The fact that he's put his entire economy on a wartime footing, the fact that they're actually increasing missile production. I don't think we can underestimate Putin's appetite for casualties. At the same time, I don't want to throw out the notion that peace could happen very, very quickly, even if it were on terms that were friendly to Ukraine, and Putin would portray it as victory. We have to remember he is a dictator in total control of everything the Russians see and hear, and he would have no problem at flipping his base and making them say that whatever peace deal he came to right now would be in Russia's interest in a total victory. So on the one hand, I think Putin will continue the fight because he has the resources to continue without additional U.S. sanctions, without additional EU action. He can continue this fight for quite some time. At the same time, he could stop it tomorrow if he really wanted to. And so it's a matter of shifting him from the status quo position of incremental gains on the battlefield and the continued slaughter of Ukrainian civilians to, negotiating on the basis of a long-term stable peace like the Europeans have been pushing for, with Ukraine firmly embedded in Western political and military structures to prevent this from ever happening again, and still call it victory. And he could still say, maybe Zelensky holds elections and someone else wins, and he says, see, I denazified Ukraine, everything's good, we won. So we'll see what happens next. It's a really tough situation, and I wouldn't want to be in Zelensky's shoes. It's such a difficult position he's in, and the internal pressure that's happening in Ukraine right now, and watching all of these negotiations powerless from the sidelines while his people are suffering. It's a really tough position, but I think he should hold firm here. And again, we'll see what happens over the next few days about these talks that happen in Moscow.
And just lastly, we heard yesterday President Putin saying words to the effect that the Europeans aren't serious about peace and that Russia is ready for war, he said. And I'm wondering how that will have gone down with the foreign ministers gathered in Brussels. And an extension of that point, he sounds like he's really trying to drive a wedge here between the Europeans and the Americans. And, some might argue he's having some success.
I think you're absolutely right that he is trying to drive a wedge. And quite frankly, it's remarkable how little daylight there has been over the entirety of the past 12 years, say, between Europe and the United States, that Putin has continually disappointed Trump in his talks. And I think that will continue. But yes, he certainly wants to divide Europe and the United States. This is a long-term Putin goal. This is a long-term Soviet goal. It goes back 70 years trying to separate the United States from European security because Putin knows, he can intimidate and threaten and maybe even conquer Europe as the Soviets always threatened to do in a conflict if the United States doesn't intervene. So that wedge is very important to Putin. But so far, I think the allies, especially here in the second term, have really learned how to work behind the scenes to help Trump to try to achieve his goals without throwing them under the bus. And so the division is not as big as I expected. And again, depending on how these talks, how the fallout goes, we could see actually the U.S. and European viewpoints align on Ukraine. That's what I'm hoping for anyway.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. William Alberg, always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Now, turning our attention to South America. Is the US on the brink of conflict with Venezuela? Well, President Trump has indicated that he wants Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, to be removed from power or for him to be put behind bars. Well, this comes at a time when US warships are reportedly within striking distance of the Latin American country. But why is President Trump targeting Maduro? Well, there are a few main reasons. Firstly, he blames Maduro for the surge of Venezuelan migrants, claiming that President Maduro is emptying prisons and, quote, insane asylums and forcing inmates to migrate to the United States. Secondly, as part of President Trump's war on drugs, the US accuses Maduro himself of running one of Venezuela's drug cartels, while Maduro denies both of these accusations, saying that President Trump is only really interested in Venezuela's oil reserves. Well, we're joined now by Venezuelan journalist Diego Sequeira, who joins us now from Caracas. Diego, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Let's look at the situation as things currently stand. There are estimated to be 15,000 American troops in the region. The USS Gerald Ford, a massive aircraft carrier, is there, along with numerous other vessels that have been sent to the Caribbean. Tensions, lots of threats. How's that affecting the mood in Venezuela? What is the mood in Venezuela right now?
Well, if you walk, Caracas, Caracas is the most populated city in Venezuela, and I work in a very crowded area. I'm not there right now, but this has been the case for at least almost 4 months. People are basically about their own business. People, you could say they are unimpressed, maybe some moments of anxiety regarding, for example, the flights, the no-flight zone that they're trying to push in Venezuela. But basically, we've been here before in general terms. Of course, there's a big difference now with the buildup in the Caribbean, but this is not the first time we've been under very heavy pressure. I actually went to the beach yesterday, which is a half-hour drive from Caracas, and there was a lot of normie families around, and I even got to see a commercial flight passing by. So this shows you that at least at this point, this pressure, this psychological shaping of the situation, it's not working as they think they want them to work, because it is one of the most definitive elements here. It's precisely to try to find some sort of internal reaction, some social breakdown or something that ease up the regime change effort we're seeing.
Yeah, the United States has carried out numerous strikes in international waters on boats that are alleged to have been carrying drugs, cartels, figures. More than 80 people are being killed in the strikes. And I'm wondering how that has gone down in Venezuela. What are people saying about that?
Well, they look at it pretty bad. You don't have to be a Maduro supporter to see through what's going on there and see how unfair that is. And basically, it amounts to a crime, a war crime now, as we've seen the media landscape addressing precisely the admiral who, at the first attack, double-tapped survivors. So, and it's clear also that it's in a very opaque way that it's been introduced to the public. It's basically a gray zone they created to do summary executions to people that they don't actually show any kind of evidence supporting the fact that they are drug traffickers whatsoever. And there are even further technical aspects. They state that these small boats are sending fentanyl into the United States, but these boats, first of all, are not able to reach U.S. shores, and second of all, there's no drug producing in Venezuela whatsoever. This is a fact acknowledged by by the UN. It's also acknowledged by the World Customs Organization. It's also acknowledged by the DEA properly. So, and especially fentanyl. I mean, Venezuela, it has a problem of being a transit point, which amounts to 5 to 7% of the drug flows that comes from South America. 87% or more comes from Ecuador and Colombia. And so this is basically counterfactual. This has nothing to do with drugs. It is a very dangerous chapter that's been opening regarding the region. And but it clearly shows that it's not about drugs. Also, you can see what happened in Honduras recently with Juan Orlando Hernandez, former president, who was actually indicted with smuggling 400 tons of cocaine into the United States and a 45 years jail time and condemnation. And he has been pardoned by Trump, and he has been lobbied up by people close to Marco Rubio. So one more time, this shows this is not about drugs.
Okay, I mean, if the goal here by the United States is to somehow isolate President Nicolas Maduro, including amongst his own population, and I know there's a strong opposition movement in Venezuela, is it having the desired effect? Is it having the effect Washington wants it to have, or is it perhaps having the opposite effect and actually translating into a sense of sympathy and a sense of perhaps solidarity with President Maduro?
You know, there's the opposition spectrum in Venezuela is actually split. You have a more rational legal opposition, and I say legal because they actually they recognize the the democratic process, and they recognize also Maduro as a president, and they also are against sanctions, and they are also against a U.S. military adventure against Venezuela. There's an extremist faction, yes, that do support this. I think it's a smaller one. Of course, it's rallied around now around Maria Corina Machado, the recent quote-unquote peace laureate, Nobel Peace Prize laureate. But this feature has happened before. Back in the first Trump cycle administration in 2019, they also did a lot of bravado about coming into the country and trying, no options are off the table and so on. And this didn't have the effect they were expecting. I mean, regardless of people supporting Chavismo or not, and there's a strong base also that supports Chavismo, the Bolivarian Revolution, they are not supporting foreign meddling to that extension and to that level and this level of intensity. I think the difference has to be established here. And also, if something gets to happen, think about for example, a hypothetical airstrike. It's going to have a stronger blowback, and it's going to have even more general rejection. There are even polls that actually shows that at least around 80% of the population are against this way of solving our problems. So that sets up the picture of how there's not an actual consensus regarding a military attack or the regime change efforts that we're seeing right now.
Okay, so in a scenario in which the United States deploys ground troops to Venezuela, what sort of a reception do you think they would be given?
I think it's the usual reception for a foreign power to occupy a nation. We've seen it before. We've seen it, I mean, ever since this century started, just to frame it a bit, that's usually the case. So think about Iraq, think about Afghanistan, think about any other country that has been occupied, especially by a foreign superpower, and specifically by the United States. This wouldn't be different. Although I think the military occupation or invasion is one of the least probable scenarios currently. They don't have enough manpower to do this. It amounts, yes, to 40,000, 50,000 troops, but you need above 100,000 to be able to occupy a country with the extension of Venezuela. In that case, it actually will fall into the usual asymmetrical trap. And also, this is, by the way, Venezuela's military doctrine. It focuses mainly on asymmetrical warfare and also integral defense, which involves, it is a whole of a society approach, which, if given a scenario of a more kinetic scenario, it will prove to be the way that in which the United States could have a hard time. So, and military planners and even think tankers are actually aware of this scenario, and most of them don't recommend it. Most of this, by the way, it's relying on some sort of internal breaking point, some sort of internal quote-unquote regime change effort in order to ease up and make things easier for achieve these clearly stated goals against Venezuela.
Okay, we'll come on to that in just a moment, but just staying with the military scenario, I just want to ask you, I mean, there are people who are concerned, some analysts, that a ground invasion could trigger a broader regional war. I don't know what you think of that. But I also want to ask you, if Venezuela were to be invaded by the United States, which of Venezuela's allies, I mean, who are Venezuela's allies, and would they come to Venezuela's defense, do you think?
I don't think there's a probable scenario in which we're going to see, I don't know, Iranian, Chinese, or Russian troops coming to help Venezuela. I think they help enough regarding with a comprehensive agreements that Venezuela has already. And what sense does it make to come and help a country that would be unable to defend itself? Venezuela relies basically on Venezuelans, and it could be a bleak scenario. And you can also expect, for example, some more informal reactions, as you know, volunteering from the region or even from the outside the region, joining in Venezuela's defense. But this scenario in which any of these big players gets directly involved in the war effort, I don't see it happening. But you have to take into account that one of the reasons this is happening is precisely to try to expel from the region any other player that it's not the United States, be it the three big multipolar betters like China, Russia, and Iran again, but also other foreign players that also are involved in Venezuela and with Venezuela regarding trade and oil. So this is one of the main reasons they're doing this, and they won't stop if it gets to succeed in Venezuela, which I highly doubt it still. They won't stop there. This is not about only regime change. This is about regional change as well.
Let's talk a bit about President Maduro and how strong his position looks right now. He held a rally on Monday. I mean, thousands of people attended that, although that doesn't necessarily mean very much because thousands of people could also be a minority, politically speaking. But have you seen any shifts in his popularity, and is he looking vulnerable?
I don't think he's looking vulnerable right now, even though with such it's unmanageable amount of intense pressure. I don't see that happening. And, you know, in several junctures, especially throughout the last 5 years, in which Venezuela has gone through significant hardships. I'm thinking about, for example, the early days of COVID, in which we were already in this awkward and strange divide with which part of the foreign international community was actually recognizing an unvoted imaginary president. People ended up recognizing as the problem solver the Venezuelan government and Nicolás Maduro himself, because it is not only a matter of support, a matter of just political support to Nicolás Maduro. There are two things here that need to be taken into account. First of all, is that common Venezuelans won't do the bid for some opposition activists very close to the United States in order to allow them to reach into power with their own blood. That's one of them. And the other one is that people here are far more interested in keeping up their normalcy, which has been slowly and slightly recovered from 10 years of economic terrorism and sanctions. And this also explains why people aren't that worked up currently. That's the actual main priority right now. And it is this government that has been giving that, regardless of some economic difficulties, which are not the ones from the past. But the other thing is that this is not the first time, like I said before, that Venezuela and the president have been under a massive amount of pressure. I can't think of other countries that are able to endure as much as President Maduro has, and also capable of maneuvering the way he has, regardless of the impact many of this foreign meddling has had. And yeah, also the internal difference that might exist.
And I want to ask you about the phone conversation that happened reportedly on the 21st of November between President Maduro and President Trump. President Maduro was given a one-week ultimatum to leave Venezuela. And obviously that ultimatum has been and gone, although airspace was closed, as we've been saying in the last few days. Are there any signs, or are there any people who think that it's likely that President Maduro will go quietly?
Yeah, I don't think that's the scenario. I have heard many people saying, people not from Venezuela saying, like, if it's the proper agreement, he will, but that's not how things work regarding sovereignty, independence, and national commitment. And I know they seem to sound like tall words, but they do have a meaning, and they have a deep meaning, especially when you are holding the line and facing this kind of threats for such a long time. And especially if you lose some ground because of all this, and this is basically what you get, because if you don't have this, you don't have anything. And this is very much ingrained not only in the president, but throughout the country, including people that not necessarily support him. Also, there's no actual legally grounded no-fly zone. This has been based on a post by President Trump after a NOTAM, a not to airmen, but there are still, of course there are less, but there's still commercial flights going on. Colombia has just ordered the airlines that aren't working, that obey this NOTAM, to resume flights, and some airlines haven't stopped flying to Venezuela. Yes, the number has reduced, but there's still an active air traffic. So I think that's important to take into account as well, because this also cuts through the bravado that's been seen, and also including the bravado that the ultimatum proves, if that was the actual case, because I haven't heard anything from the Venezuelan side, so I'm cautious. And where does the facts start and the spin ends, you know?
I mean, Diego, you're making it sound like the majority of Venezuelans are standing beside their president, standing behind their president. They support their president. He's been in power for 12 years, having replaced Hugo Chavez. The economy is in a dire situation and has been for most of the last 12 years. There was an election last year that a number of countries, not just the United States, believe was a sham election, and that the real winner was Edmundo Gonzalez. That's certainly what the United States would say about that election. I mean, is there a sense that perhaps it's time for a change in Venezuela, or you don't seem to think that anyone is of the opinion that the country needs to have a change of direction?
Well, I don't know exactly change of direction as a whole. I do think that many things need to improve. And also, I might add, on the macroeconomical level, things have actually improved, and this has been shown by the UN properly. The Latin American Economic Commission shows that Venezuela now has recovered and is one of the fastest growing economy in the hemisphere. Same with oil production. After bringing it to almost to a full halt 5 years ago, and into a 99% decrease of oil revenues, currently it has reached the monthly 1 million barrel mark. So things have slowly actually recovering. This doesn't depict also a rosy picture of where we're at right now. We don't have the supply and storage situation we had 10 years ago. We don't have the same problems regarding power purchasing, but there are many important issues to be addressed and need to be solved. Many of them are strictly related to the sanctions and blockade program we've gone through for the last decade. And also, I might say that maybe it's not the full support to the president, but there's the support to defend Venezuela from this kind of violent operations, which I might add, it also includes it doesn't need to, like I said before, it doesn't need to be supporting the president automatically, but supporting and defending the country from this kind of dangerous situations.
Okay. I mean, are we hearing anything from the opposition? Because, I mean, I know a number of opposition leaders over the last 12 years or so have actually been put in prison. A few names spring to mind, like Leopoldo Lopez, and there have been others as well. I mean, are the opposition seizing on this opportunity, as they may see it, and being vocal in perhaps encouraging the United States to go ahead and bring about some kind of a change of leadership in the country?
Well, you have the usual suspect, the usual extremist opposition, which actually Leopoldo Lopez is one of the staple representatives, same as our Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who also vocally supports military operation against Venezuela. And she's been quite frank about this for a long time, but this is not the case of the whole opposition. Many of the segments of opposition realized back in 2019, 2020, they were basically losing their complete political capital because this was pushing them to the abyss, which parties like Voluntad Popular, Leopoldo López party, fell into. Because one thing is political prisoners, and another thing is politicians in jail. And by the way, Leopoldo López is fine and alive and well in Madrid currently. And he was able to leave the country in a very, he was able to leave, but I don't think that was much of a stealthy move. I think he was allowed to, but that's just a personal opinion. And the problem here is it's about the opposition hegemony and the ways and means of being represented in media, and also their own courage in stating their own position. That you have another high-profile figure like Enrique Capriles Radonsky, who ran for office against Hugo Chavez first and then against Nicolás Maduro, who actually doesn't support a military operation against Venezuela. They could be a bit more vocal, if you ask me, but I also know for a fact, and this is an informed opinion, that many of these people are actually under far more pressure than Chavista politicians from the more extreme oppositions. Many of these opposition politicians have also been sanctioned by the United States, so that should also tell you something about the situation regarding the more moderate legal factions of the opposition.
Okay, well, I'm being told we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for your time. We appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Diego Sequeira, journalist in Venezuela. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.